Hello, everybody. I hope you all can hear me, see me, and see Alison. Hi, and good afternoon. My name is Karen Burstein. I'm the programmer for the Jewish Film Festival, and welcome to everybody this afternoon. We are having a wonderful guest join us this afternoon, Alison Gillmor, who you all know, and many of you might even remember from a couple of years ago. Alison did a wonderful talk post-film The Museum, which was a great movie about the Israel Museum. And she gave a fantastic talk that people still comment on, and it's great. And so I'm looking forward to hearing what she has to say about all the movies we've seen so far this week. She's been watching them along with us all this week, and about the movies to come next week. So before we begin, just a couple of housekeeping details. Everyone who has entered the room has been automatically muted and their cameras have been shut off, just to make things easier. And of course, this is a live event. We don't anticipate any technical glitches, but if there are any, please have patience and we'll rectify those as soon as possible. And Alison is going to be talking. Of course, we're all welcome to send questions, and if you'd like to do so, please do it via the chat at the bottom and please send them to me, Karen Burstein, and I will relay the questions to Alison. And before we get started, I just want to say how happy and thrilled I am that the festival took place this year, despite the circumstances that we all find ourselves in. Many people said to me that they'd hoped that the festival would happen this year virtually, and we are thrilled that it did. And that is in large part to the Asper Foundation and the Babs Asper Centre for Cultural Arts, who are the Winnipeg International Jewish Film Festival sponsor. And it's because of them and their passion for the arts that the festival is happening and is free to attend this year. So thank you very much to them. And so I think that's it. So I've just reminded everyone that the cameras are off and the sound is off. So please ask any questions via chat. And now I'd like to introduce Alison Gillmor, an arts and pop culture critic, and the former contract academic staff in the Department of Art History at the U of W, and a current educator at McNally's Community Classroom. Welcome, Alison. We're so happy to have you here today.
Thanks. Thank you for having me.
Our pleasure. So you've been watching the movies with us this week.
Yes.
So day by day, we're getting links sent out, which is kind of a fun way to do it. And we want to hear, just for the sake of time, we weren't able to talk about all the films that we've shown last week and all the ones we're going to be showing this week, but you've selected a few to talk about. And so we're looking forward to hearing about that. And I think we'll probably do it in the order as they came out. Came out in.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And that in that case, we'll start with Good Thoughts, Good Words, Good Deeds, which was a documentary about Zubin Mehta, maestro. And it was done by a German director called Bettina Ehrhardt. And it was done in sort of in honor, I guess, or as an homage to the maestro on the 80th year of his birth, which was a couple of years ago. I think you noticed in the film that he didn't like talking about his age so much, so a couple of years ago, although as we all know. But anyway, so let's start with that movie, that documentary. What do you want to tell us about that film?
Well, one of the things I thought was, one of the things that I think really defines a documentary is its attitude or its approach to its subject. And I would say that this documentary adores its subject, unabashedly loves him, which I don't think is necessarily a bad thing. I mean, for one thing, he seems like a wonderful person, not just a towering musical talent, but a sort of a genuinely kind and decent and generous person. And at first I thought, this documentary is kind of all over the place. It was sort of bouncing around. And then I thought, well, it's literally all over the place. It shows Maida in these different places, you know, Israel, Florence, Vienna, Sarajevo, Mumbai, and suggests how these places have shaped him, and also how music might shape these places. So I think it demonstrates, it puts forward this very optimistic, very humanist idea that music can cross boundaries and connect people. And I think my favorite part of the film was just watching him conducting, you know, just the physicality of it, the grace. And so when we finally meet the Indian classical dancer who's interviewed later in the film, and she's talking about this fusion of mind and spirit and body through movement, and making these incredibly graceful hand movements, you know, it really made perfect sense to me. But that was also kind of the most frustrating part for me of the film, is that with a lot, you know, these kind of music docs, you get these tantalizing little bits of music, and then it just stops, you know, and you're moving on to the next thing. And of course, since this is part of a Jewish film festival, I think one of the important focuses was obviously how Maida is very much associated with Israel as, you know, he has the title of music director for life, which sounds a little weird, but of the Israel Philharmonic. And, you know, these issues that come up, you know, what does it mean to play the Hatikva in Germany? What does it mean to play Wagner in Israel? I kind of wished that we could do a bit more of a deep dive, but then, you know, the film kind of moved on. And this isn't mentioned in the film, but I read some interviews that Maida gave where he has said that the fact that he is Parsi helps him understand the Jewish experience. So, you know, this is this ancient monotheistic faith, and Parsi people were exiled from Persia after the Muslim conquest in the 7th century, and then subsequent persecution, and they migrated to the Indian subcontinent to live among this sort of majority Hindu population. And there's this fable that the leader of the Parsi came to this Hindu prince and said, you know, asking to live in his kingdom. And the Hindu prince pointed to this glass of milk and said, no, you see, this glass of milk is full and we can't take anymore. And the Parsi leader dropped 3 teaspoons of sugar into the milk and stirred them and said, you see, not only can we fit in your glass of milk, but we can make it sweeter. Which, I mean, I don't think that's history necessarily, but it's a great story. Yeah, what did you think, Karen?
I thought it was interesting in what you say actually about that, because of course the title of the film, Good Thoughts, Good Words, Good Deeds, is a Parsi expression.
Yeah.
And sort of exemplifies how he's lived his life too. But just on a sort of sidebar to that, because that's interesting, India in general has, I think, in its entire history, centuries of history, a marked absence of anti-Semitism, one of the only countries in the world throughout its history. I don't know how much that's played into his feelings about Israel. I just think he feels very at home there.
Yes, clearly.
But that's just an interesting thing. And you're right that it does go everywhere. But the thing about one of the members of the orchestra said that they were sort of the ambassadors, or that they did with one concert what you know, an ambassador could only hope to achieve in 3 years.
Yeah.
And I thought that was interesting, but of course you can't completely subtract the political from the artistic. You know.
Yes. The film has a very hopeful idea, and I want to think that that's true, that art can be sort of apolitical, but then I think it's certainly a question that comes up in some of these other films that in the festival this year, and they don't see it quite that way.
Well, and so just that's actually a very good segue as we go into our next film, which I thought was just an amazing film called The Sign Painter, a Latvian film. And so that's sort of a tragicomedy about an isolated sort of backwater town in Latvia in the late 1930s, 1940s. And the sort of series of regimes that sort of one after another, like serial regimes kind of entering their country and of course reaching their town, and how that affects people, their dynamic. So the story centers on this man, Antis, and you forgive my sort of lack of master about Latvian pronunciation. I think it's Antis. The main character, who's this kind of sort of naive, well-intentioned and good-hearted, in fact, young man who is a sign painter, as his father was, and aspires to be a serious artist, and also aspires to a romantic relationship with Zisela, who is the Jewish shopkeeper's daughter. And he's denied both of those things through, I guess, a series of events, historic and and not. But you know, that sort of sets the tone, and it sets the tone. The town, the tone of the town, I think, is interesting. The way it starts. You know, it's almost an idyllic town, like they have sort of, you know, afternoons by the lake, and everyone kind of gets along, although there's this kind of latent anti-Semitism that's just kind of in there, like, you know, things like, you know, don't meddle with Jews, and you know, the priest who's trying to convert the orphan kids and things like that. And so it's kind of just there, but it's, you know, it's nothing like obviously what they're going to come to see, but it's just, I thought there were so many interesting details that I'd love to hear you talk about. The camera work I thought was fantastic, and interesting how everything was kind of on a tilt the whole way. The klezmer music that sort of brought in every new regime, that was like sort of the score throughout, these almost kind of like Chagall-like sort of scenes, like wedding.
Actually.
So I'd love to hear what you think about all of that and more about the film.
Okay, I really liked this one, and I was struck by the fact when I was watching it that, I mean, so many of our sort of mainstream war movies tell us about the experience of, you know, Britain and America and Germany and maybe Russia, but we know a lot less maybe about some of these small countries, you know, sort of in the Balkans or the Baltic states, that are sort of steamrolled by these larger powers, and then are themselves filled with these like really complicated competing factions, right? So different ethnic groups, and, you know, different languages, you know, so, you know, democratic nationalists, fascist nationalists, communists, democratic socialists, anarchists, you know, and sort of how do ordinary people, like, you know, in places like this, navigate the war. So this little backwater, and I think the film is kind of asking, what does war mean for, you know, the so-called little man, you know, and we have Ansis, who does a lot of, it's almost like silent comedy, like he has this great face, right? You know, and it's sort of it's sort of expressive by not being expressive, if you know, if that makes any sense. And yeah, as you say, he just wants to live as an ordinary life, and he gets sidetracked kind of by these huge historical forces, and you know, he wants to be an artist. He ends up being a sign painter. He wants this one woman, ends up with another one. And he has very little control, seemingly, over what happens to him. But I think the film is interested in this question, this really fundamental question. Now, like, what are the decisions one can still make, even within this incredible structure of power? You know, even in these oppressive circumstances, you know, how much can you choose to behave with dignity, to behave with humanity and decency? And yeah, we see these three waves. First of all, the Latvian nationalist dictator, Carlos Ulmanis, who he did marginalize the Jews, but he also marginalized ethnic Germans, ethnic Russians. Then we get the Soviets, then we get the Nazis. And, you know, both the Soviets and the Nazis have sort of willing homegrown loyalists, with the Latvian communists and then the Latvian fascists. And you know, Zisel is in with the Soviet authorities, right? 'Cause she's an ardent kind of communist. And she warns Anzis to hide when he's on the list to be deported to Siberia by the Soviets. And then he returns the favor, by hiding her in the attic, because she's a communist and a Jew, from the Nazis when the Jewish families of the town, including her mother and father, are, being rounded up and sent to the death camps. So the tone here is obviously really tricky, right? Because you have real historical horrors that are sort of in this very stylized setting, right? And terrible events that are filtered through kind of irony, a lot of visual humor, and this combination of sort of absurdist tragedy and deadpan comedy, that I don't think is going to work necessarily for everybody. But I liked it a lot. And it uses a lot of repetition, as you said, sort of. So we go through like green, that's the nationalists, then red, the communists, and black, the fascists, and the boat coming onto the dock with the latest regime. And because Ansis is a sign painter, right, we track all these changes because he's having to like redo the signs and the names of things and the slogans and bury the latest
font as
statue.
well.
Yeah,
The font.
yeah, that's right. Can you do a Gothic font? Yeah. And even his name changes, like at some point he's Ansis and then he's Hans, depending on, how Germanic things are. Yeah. And Bernstein's shop becomes Trade Enterprise number 3 during the Soviet occupation. So yeah, and I love how the film is off kilter, like literally, like everything is at an angle, like, you feel a little seasick, actually, I think. Everything is shot at these weird angles. Nothing is on the level. Nothing is symmetrical. It's literally off balance. And I think, first of all, that kind of inverts the usual aesthetic of the sort of prestige, historical drama. And then also many of the scenes are shot like really low. So that I think you're literally getting the point of view of the little person sort of being crushed by these, the weight of history. And also like partial views or blocked views, or you can't really see what's going on. And again, the little person who's overwhelmed by history, but can only see this, small part of it, really. And then, yeah, the klezmer music, which, at one point I thought each time it seems to be getting like darker and faster and more frantic. And then I was thinking, like, is it really changing, or is this just me projecting onto it as things get worse and worse?
That's what that off kilter does to you. Just it did to the people in the town. Everything was sort of off kilter. You don't know.
Yeah, and you can't quite trust your perception.
Yeah, exactly. And I think his character I just found fascinating. Like you say, that sort of lack of expression the whole time, or that kind of deadpan sort of expression the whole time. But yeah, like those klezmer scenes as a kind of marker of time, or sort of just as a symbol of Jewish life, as Chagall did, but this is now Jewish life that is no more. And so the ironic, I won't say comic, the ironic elements, and then that really sort of heavy duty kind of theme.
Yeah.
So yeah. So, but again, it's this sort of idea that you brought up the last time. He wasn't political at all.
Right.
Most of the town wasn't really. They just sort of.
Yeah, they're just trying to keep their heads down. Right?
Each time a new regime came in, they were kind of like, well, what should we be thinking about all this? And but that idea of yes, not being political, but somehow politics always finds you, or sort of history always finds you, political events always find you. So that's kind of interesting, especially when we sort of were talking about that a little bit with the last movie as well. So kind of cool.
Absolutely.
And what was then? I think the next one was Those Who Remained.
Yes.
Which is another historical Shoah film, but completely different. There's no irony in that one at all. That is a beautiful, it's a Hungarian film. The director is Barnabas Toth. And I'm sure I'm mangling the pronunciation of that as well, but that was a I think that was the Hungarian entry for the Oscars
Yes.
last year
Yeah.
for Best Foreign Picture, the Hungarian entry. And it's a beautiful film, refined, tender, very sad, hopeful. But, you know, after many years, sort of how to get back to living life after you've come back from the camp. So just to briefly sum up, the story takes place in over, I think, about a 5-year period. So a couple of years, like 1948. So a few years after the wars ended, and the start, obviously, of the Soviet regime in the East and in Hungary as well. And it centers around a teenage girl, Clara, who's about 16, who is living with her great aunt after her great aunt found her in an orphanage after the war, and a doctor, Aldo, who is about 42. He's survived the camps. His wife and children did not, and he's come back, and they are find each other, the teenage girl and the doctor, and form a relationship, sort of a father-daughter relationship. And so tell us what you thought about that movie.
I thought it was extraordinary, and I found it deeply uncomfortable to watch at times, but it's clearly meant to be uncomfortable, and it should be uncomfortable. And I think because of that, it really resonated with me. It stayed with me. And yeah, I think, as you mentioned, I mean, we've seen many films about those who are murdered in the Holocaust, but you know, what about those who survive and then come back to the place that was their home? And, you know, and then what, you know, how do they find purpose? How do they define themselves, you know? And at one point, Clara, the girl, asks Aldo, why do you live? Which is, you know, like, it's an awful question, and it's a terrible question for a girl to ask someone so young. So, you know, it's this story of trauma and this very, very slow, difficult recovery of, you know, some hope, or at least the will to go on, you know. And yeah, so we have the, you know, the young girl and the middle-aged man, and they've both lost their families, and they form this relationship, this bond, and there are things, you know, between them, like the fact that they sleep in the same bed, for example, that would seem, you know, natural, I think, between a parent and a child. Nobody would think twice. Nobody would question it. But those natural bonds have been, you know, destroyed in the most brutal, terrible way imaginable. And the survivors are left to form the families, you know, as they can. And I think it's made even more tricky by the fact that Clara is, you know, physically, she's 16 years old, but in other ways, she's 10, you know, like her emotional development has been kind of cut off by her trauma that she experienced as a little girl. And, you know, at one point, Aldo says to a friend, he asks the age of Clara, and Aldo says, well, she's anywhere between 5 and 70, which, you know, really describes her, because, you know, she's seen things that no child should have to see. She's experienced these awful things. But she's older in some ways than 16, in these tragic ways, but she's also much younger. She's, you know, she's kind of been cut off. Her childhood was cut off. And I think Aldo is trying to kind of help her recover it. And so, you know, she's precocious, but she's also immature, and she needs people. She's terrified of abandonment, and she also pushes people away, you know. So even more than most adolescents, she's just like a walking contradiction. And I thought the performances were just revelatory. You know, Aldo clearly starts as, you know, he's incredibly depressed and traumatized and almost mute at times. And he seems to feel nothing, almost nothing. And then Clara starts off, she's just a raw nerve, like she's feeling too much. And I think gradually they kind of both come toward a middle place, you know. And I think the filmmaker treats their bond with, you know, great subtlety, great delicacy.
Is there any room for ambiguity in the way? I mean, does the director do you say like leave any room for some ambiguity about the relationship?
I think there's just a bit, like, it's ambiguous but not icky is how I would put it.
Okay.
Again, like if you had, like, say, a mother and a son, and she was divorced and she started dating a new guy, you might say, oh, the son is jealous of, and that's kind of, we all take that for granted. But when they're not biologically related, when they're not sort of father and daughter, it seems kind of strange, that he's a bit jealous of when she starts dating. She's a bit jealous when he starts dating. Their relationship is hard to define.
And there is nothing. There is nothing icky about it. But
no. I mean, when she crosses that line on that terrible night.
Yeah.
When she's reliving trauma, clearly, and he immediately cuts things off, moves the bedding to the couch. So there's nothing untoward, I think, but it shows how difficult this relationship is to define. The other thing I thought was really interesting about it was, I think as we see more films coming out of the former Soviet bloc countries, I think we see more about the experience of Jews under the Soviet regimes, and it just seems so historically unfair, that you have these characters, they're just starting to recover from the trauma of the Holocaust, and then they're facing the dangers of Stalinism and Soviet anti-Semitism. And when Alda goes to the parent-teacher interview, and he's getting these kind of coded messages, right? Like the teachers are saying, well, it's not good to stand out. It's not good to be exceptional, it's like a code for saying it's not good to be Jewish, and we see his older friend who joins the Communist Party, obviously not because he's a communist, but because he wants to protect his wife and his children. But, like, just, again, these awful choices, these awful circumstances,
I thought, the one scene I keep thinking of a lot in that film is when he finally is ready to sort of share his family with her by letting her look at the photo albums. And there was not like if I recall correctly, there wasn't any dialogue. There was no words. There was nothing, no sound, no speaking, no dialogue in that scene at all. It was just a really fantastic scene. But a very refined movie. And like you say, not so many films about the Shoah, about the people who come back. And I think at one point, Clara says something like, it's harder for us than those who left or those who stayed behind. So that was an interesting movie. And so the next one I think that we want to talk about is
Sublet.
Yeah, okay. I can't remember the order we did. Sublet came before. Oh yeah, okay. Well, let's do Sublet. Why not?
Sure.
So Sublet is very contemporary.
Yes, extremely contemporary.
And a drama set in Tel Aviv by the director Eitan Fox. Many of you might know who did the film The Bubble. Also the TV series Florentine in the late 90s. It was kind of like an Israeli Friends. And also another film called Yossi and Jagger. And the film Florentine, set in Florentine, which is a kind of hipster neighborhood in Tel Aviv, once, sort of grungy, now sort of regentrified. And that is where this movie, Sublet, is set. I think it's where the director lives, and so he's very familiar with it. And the film centers around a middle-aged or late middle-aged, I guess, New York Times travel writer named Michael, who comes to Tel Aviv to write a travel story for his column, and he sublets the apartment of Tomer, who is the polar opposite of him in character. They're kind of thrust together. They're both gay men, but it's interesting because it's sort of a wider lens of sort of male gay experience. It's not sort of monolithic or anything. Like there's just obviously different, all kinds of different characters, different values, different everything. And so these two men with different characters and different values are sort of joined together for the 5 days that this writer is in Tel Aviv. So yeah, tell us what you think about that film.
I really liked it. You know, as you say, we have like two men. They're both Jewish, they're both gay, but very different, as you said, two generations, two cultures. Yeah, and just I really felt for Michael when he walks into the, because I'm sort of neat and uptight, and like I don't get Airbnbs. Like that's what hotels are for, you know, like. And he walks into this like just mess of an apartment, and and I thought it was interesting because, you know, if you just from the description, it could sound like, oh, it's going to be like this May December kind of cliche, or an opposites attract cliche, and it's neither of those things, you know, like it's something much more delicate and subtle, and I like that it's by no means fated that they're going to end up sleeping together, like and I like that the you know, the gap in their age, it's not just, you know, like when you hear people say, oh, age is just a number, and it's just like, no, it really is not just a number. Like there's a real actual generational divide, and they have very different attitudes to all sorts of things, like, you know, like just like when Michael hears that two of Tomer's friends want to go live in Berlin, and he's kind of like taken aback. Like to him, Berlin is just, it's this site of Jewish trauma, and the younger generation is just like, they don't even, that doesn't even register with them. It's just like a cool place to go, right? And then the AIDS crisis, very different, attitudes to that, different attitudes to modern Israel, I think. And even different attitudes to movies, like that scene where Tomer is showing us what looks like a pretty terrible film, like Rosemary's Baby with lizards, you know. So, you know, and Tomer, he can't even imagine a monogamous relationship, much less, you know, a long marriage. And then Michael's attitudes, I think, when he sees Tomer just, you know, who's kind of just, you know, he has these, you know, no strings attached, you know, encounters with multiple sex partners. And for Michael, that's always seen through this filter of loss, because he lived through the AIDS crisis, he lost his first boyfriend. Yeah, and I just, so I like that it starts with Michael, you know, who writes this column called The Intrepid Traveler, and he doesn't seem very intrepid at all, right? And as we learn later, this is because he's experienced the terrible pain of losing a child, and also just he's also going through just the general experience of being middle-aged, I guess. You know, which the film sees as sort of part wisdom, but part inertia, I think. And then Tomer, he initially just seems like he's all there on this very beautiful surface. I mean, he's gorgeous, but he's also more complicated. And I think especially in the scene where we go to the kibbutz and we find something about his childhood and his mother, and, you know, and then they have this very brief, very sweet moment, and they both take away something from it that, you know, I think they will bring back to their regular lives, you know, which I just found it very, very touching. Yeah.
I think I'm curious to hear what you think about how Tel Aviv, the city itself, which is obviously the backdrop of the film, is used to help tell the story, sort of the story of the contrasting values of the two men, right, and who are from different generations, and sort of ideas about, I guess, sort of universal ideas or Tel Avivian ideas about life. I mean, it's a very libertine city, obviously, but there's so many layers to it. I mean, the sort of old world, you know, old cafe society of Europe. There's high tech. There's, you know,
Bauhaus,
Bauhaus, and the suits and all of it. But anyway, I just, yes, how they use the city to tell the story.
Well, you know, I just, you know, there's, as you say, and of course you're a travel writer, Karen, so you know these things, and you've been there. I've never been to Tel Aviv, so except cinematically. And there's
good,
this
I
sense of
must
all
say.
these layers, and I think Tomer says at one point, it's Middle Eastern, but it's also Western, it's kind of both those things at once. And, this incredible, vibrant, gay culture, and party culture, which Tomer just takes for granted. And I think must make Michael think of, like New York in the 80s kind of. And what one thing I thought was interesting is, he's there for 5 days to sort of sum up Tel Aviv, right, as a travel writer. And like, can you do that in 5 days? Like, that's a toughie.
To sum up, no,
No.
not really, but sum up, no, because the city, and certainly Tel Aviv, I think is a fairly complex city, like I say,
Yeah.
with all these different layers, so you can't really get to its essence in 5 days. But I think that is somewhat realistic, that a travel writer would go to a city and, if not find the essence of the city, find the story that they're looking for. And it usually takes a few days, and those first few days you're kind of like, shit, I don't have a story. And then, you see something, or you meet somebody or whatever, and you're like, that's the story. And this tells the story of Tel Aviv, or my experience, or this part of Tel Aviv. And so, yes and no. I mean, there is some things as a travel writer I was like a bit nitpicky about. But, but those are minor things. Overall, I think that was, you can tell a story. You can get an idea. You can get that you can sort of land on that sort of certain aspect of the city that is there for the town,
kind of the key in. And I really liked that you that the relationship between the two leads is also has these layers, like it's friendship, it's sort of familial in a way, there's this, and then it's erotic as well.
And
that's like great. Honestly, and that's that key scene. I wasn't sure, like, are they just going to sort their socks, or are they going to have sex? And you don't really know.
But the familiar is very important too, because that's another extremely important layer of Israeli society. I mean, it's so, and he takes him home to meet his mother after 3 days. That's completely natural. And you meet somebody, and you're 3 days later, you're meeting their whole family. But that aspect of it, that's another layer that's kind of cool. And I thought the chemistry of the two characters was really interesting. The actor who played Michael is John Benjamin Hickey, I believe his name is, a very well-respected theatrical actor. And the young man who played Tomer, I'm sorry, his name escapes me. He's a complete newcomer, and I thought he was wonderful as well. I really liked the kind of lo-fi chemistry between them in a way, sort of like it was all sort of subtly played out, right? That, and then the last film that I want to talk about from last week is Born in Jerusalem and Still Alive. So, which is another film I really, really liked. It's very much a dark comedy, but it and a bit of a sort of quirky romance, but it's very much, most of all, about the absurdity, if you will, of daily life in Israel, and most essentially about that period in Israel that is kind of collectively been repressed in a lot of ways, as the movie sort of alludes to, but still really drives almost every aspect of life in Israel today. Politically, for sure, the idea of security versus peace, et cetera, et cetera. But anyway, this film is about a young man, Ronen, who grew up on Jaffa Street in Jerusalem, and was growing up there in the 1990s, late 90s, and early 2000s, at the time of the Intifada. And I use the word Intifada because that is the word we all use. But as they point out in the movie,
I thought that was really interesting.
There's no Hebrew. There's no Hebrew term for that. It's an Arab term, and they just call it the situation. So that sort of sets the tone. That everything is, obviously, like I say, drives daily life very much, but has been kind of collectively repressed. So anyway, he one day happens upon a tour guide giving a tour, one of those banal tours of Jaffa Street. And he's just kind of like, okay, you're not talking about all the terrible things that happened here. And so he decides to give terror tours of Jerusalem. And he's doing it really to overcome his own trauma.
Yeah, yeah.
But there's a lot of dark humor in it, and a lot of very, very funny moments, like the way there's a lot of satire in it.
Yeah.
The way they sort of, about tour guides, for one thing. If you saw Simpsons when Sacha Baron Cohen played the tour guide when the Simpsons went to Israel. So there's a lot right for satirizing in tour guides, but that's sort of the back part of the story. It's really sort of about this huge aspect of Israeli society.
Yeah, I thought it was, it was another kind of unclassifiable, like it's hard to kind of stick it into a genre, as with many of these films, which I think is terrific. And yeah, like when you see Ronan and he's constantly repeating the phrase terror attack, and it becomes weirdly almost like a kind of a comic bit, right? Like when he's saying, no, we can't stop at that terror attack. We have to go down the street, see this other terror attack, kind of. But it's also this kind of mantra that it's almost like he's just repeating it to ward off this deep anxiety that he has. And I think, the late scene in the film when he finally talks about, being in the street when a bomb goes off at a cafe and seeing, death and blood and terror. And I don't think it's meant to be like a big surprise, like a big reveal. I think most viewers have recognized really from the very beginning of the film that he is doing these tours. He's offering them for free out of some terrible personal trauma that he's trying to deal with and to overcome. And of course, yeah, as you say, this becomes a kind of representation of this larger Israeli experience, this paradox that terror attacks are sudden and terrible and catastrophic, but also at times common in a way most North Americans just can't comprehend. And I think, you could maybe comprehend it intellectually, but you don't feel it viscerally unless you're living there. And so how do people deal with that constant press at the back of their mind, when they get on a bus or when they sit at a cafe to have coffee? And and I think it makes this weird comedy over what is appropriate and what is inappropriate, so that like, should you be taking selfies on your terror tour attack, or your terror attack tour? Should you sell terror attack merchandise as Ronan's friend does? Like I'm thinking like, he's selling towels. Like, what do they look like? What's a terror attack towel? And like, okay, if 8 people die, if 12 people die, if 23 people die, can you have a beer? Can you go on a date? And Ronan makes these differentiations between routine terror attacks and extreme terror attacks. And you're thinking like, how can a terror attack ever be seen as routine? And he asks this question, like, is it life affirming to go on a date, to kind of reclaim the streets? Or is it callous? And he's trying to get them, he's comically trying to break down these, these incredibly difficult, impossible questions into these charts, where he has like numbers and check marks and things. And then I thought the most poignant part was the phone call, when he asks participants on the tour.
Gave everyone an old
yeah, to pretend call the ones they love and say they're okay. And I think this counterpoints his phone calls with his father, which are kind of fraught, and kind of comic, but and say something about their relationship, which is kind of close, but sort of like kind of overly intertwined. Again, I think as a sign of this kind of, anxiety and fear about the well-being of each other, And I just found Yossi Attia, the lead actor. He's just like a really appealing guy. I just like his face, he's got a great face.
You kind of know him, huh?
Yeah, and I liked his relationship with Asia, the architecture student, and she talks about like Jerusalem being a very heavy place to live, I think is her phrase. And that's an idea that also comes up in Sublet, which I saw some real, connections between the two films in some ways. And I also, what I thought was kind of interesting is that obviously this is a super Israeli film, like really rooted in the streets of Jerusalem, but it also uses the format of the tours, which Ronan specifies are meant for non-Israelis, partly because Israelis are too argumentative, as he says. But it kind of examines how non-Israelis view Israel and what it represents to them. So, like I didn't know anything about the Japanese Makuya Zionist group, but it's huge, I guess. Or, the Tel Aviv women's rugby team, or the African Orthodox, clerics, Christian clerics, the American kids coming for their bar mitzvah or their bat mitzvah. It was interesting to see Israel kind of refracted through that tour and all these different groups taking it.
Absolutely. Yeah, like you say, the terrorism etiquette, okay, if you're on a bus and you can go on a date after because it's routine. It's you don't, it doesn't really mean anything, but it's sort of all kind of accepted rules of life, I guess, in the city. So I think we're getting a little short on time. I just want to say, if anyone has any questions that they want to ask of Alison, then please just send a message via the chat to me, and I will relay it to her. But in the time we have left, I just want to wrap up what we have coming up for next week, because we have another week's, starting today, of wonderful films. And Alison is going to kind of give us capsule reviews of some of those, just because we don't have a lot of time. But tonight, the film, or today, I guess, that you got the links to, everyone, was a documentary called Not a Love Story, which is a very difficult subject. And it is the story of a woman who was an inmate at Auschwitz, who had a love affair with an SS, and who, because of that, kept her and people close to her alive. And obviously this is a true story. And the documentary is told in a very interesting cinematography of it is interesting. You use different techniques to tell the story, sort of old footage, interviews with the real woman, and sort of cutouts and all kinds of different techniques to tell the story. So it's an incredible movie, very difficult, certainly one that you'll want to see. Was the winner of the Best Israeli Documentary at Doc Aviv. It was just a tremendously important film this year in Israel. And so that is today's film. And next week, starting tomorrow, we have a Picture of His Life, which is a film about an underwater, I guess you could say, underwater wildlife photographer, a famed Israeli photographer, who is probably, like I say, the best in the world, and has an all-consuming ambition to take a picture of polar bear swimming underwater, which, as we all know, predatory polar bears are not somebody you want to get close to, but that is absolutely the thing that he thinks will crown his career. And it's more than it's a documentary, but it's also sort of like, I guess, a trauma document. I don't know what the kind of sort of dealing with his trauma, his past trauma, growing up in Israel with the family he had, with the past experience he's had in the war, etc., how that plays into the kind of person he is and what he wants to achieve. So we have that tomorrow, and the day after, a film called Asia, so a mother-daughter drama, another very intense drama with Shira Haas, who you probably all know from Shtisel and The Unorthodox. And an amazing, again, tough and intense film, but beautifully acted, a very, very good film that is on Tuesday. If I'm not mistaken, Wednesday is When Hitler Stole Pink Rabbit. And some of you may remember the film Nowhere in Africa by the same director, and which tells a similar story, but it's not the same story, and that's interesting. It's the Nowhere in Africa told the story of a German family who were went into exile in Africa, Nairobi, I believe, in the war. And this tells the story of a prominent journalist and his family who sort of go from place to place looking for refuge in the year, really, as soon as Hitler's comes into power. And then after that, we have sort of a lighter fare, If You See My Mother, a French comedy, sort of relatively light. Of course, none of these comedies are just light.
It's all relative, really.
It's all relative, and in fact, it is all relative. It's about this man who is very close to his mother, really a mama's boy.
One way of putting it, yeah.
And she dies, but he continues to see her and believe she's still there. He eats with her, he talks to her, etc. And this carries on until he meets a woman who is, I believe, a psychiatrist, and puts an end to that, or tries to put an end to that. So slightly comic fare. And then after that, we have Incitement, which is the all too real life story of the, but it's played out as a psychological thriller of the inside the mind of the man who assassinated Yitzhak Rabin in 1995, and all this tumult in Israel after the Oslo Accords were signed, and really, I mean, the incredibly tense, volatile atmosphere of the country after the peace accords really brought Israel almost to the brink of civil war. And so, those who incited it, and those who, it's a tough film, but it's a fantastic film, I thought. Very good. After that, we have on next Saturday, a documentary called Beyond the Music. I'm sorry, I'm rushing through this, but because we're running out of time, and I see we have a couple of questions, and I want Alison to talk about some of these films. And this is another documentary, another music documentary. This time it's talking about Daniel Barenboim's famous sort of Israeli, Argentine, German, French, polyglot and multi-talented music director who has started an academy in Berlin, which brings together young music students from all over the Middle East. So Israelis playing next to Iranians, all in the same orchestra. And of course, the reasons, the hopeful and philosophical reasons behind that. And then closing next Sunday, wonderful and timely documentary called Shared Alliance, which talks about the history of the Black Jewish Alliance during Civil War in the US in the 1960s, Black Jewish history prior to that, and the future of Black Jewish history. Now, of course, in the news a little bit again with the elections in Georgia, and sort of the importance of that historic alliance continuing today. So that's sort of in a nutshell all the films. And so Alison, what do you want to tell us about some of those?
Okay, well, I'll just kind of follow up on three of the ones you mentioned, like The Picture of His Life, about the wildlife photographer. And I just thought, if you feel a little housebound, it's a gorgeous film. Just like his photographs are jaw-dropping, and then there's all this footage of the Canadian North, which is really beautiful, and it's set up on this premise, that he wants to take this photograph of the polar bear, and there are all these people being interviewed, and they're saying, it's unfinished business. This time it's personal. The bear is symbolic, and it sounds like it's going to be like Ahab and the White Whale and Moby Dick. And I thought at first, okay, this setup, they're trying a little too hard to make this sort of like mythic. And then like 20 minutes later, I was like, it's totally mythic. It is mythic. So I really liked it, and I found it interesting that most of it takes place in Nunavut, and yet it is really connected to the history of Israel, his father's military service in the War of Independence, and then his own military service in the Yom Kippur War. And his sister says at one point, he came back, but he never came home, which really struck me, stayed with me. And then Asya, which, as you say, is this very small drama focusing on a single mother and her teenage daughter, and the mother, Asya had the daughter when she was very young, and they look almost like sisters, and they live in this cramped apartment, Asia works as a nurse, night shifts, day shifts. Vika, the daughter, is sort of left to herself. She gets into trouble, but the mother is also getting into trouble, and their relationship is almost like sisters sometimes. And even sometimes Vika, the teenager, seems like the parent, and the mother is kind of the reckless teenager. But then Vika has a degenerative disease, and as her condition worsens, I think, the mother and daughter kind of rediscover each other and rediscover the strength of their bond. And Asia, I think, rediscovers herself as a mother. And it's, I think it's a story about them generally, but also about modern urban isolation. Like Asia is a Russian Israeli who emigrated when her daughter was very small. So they really only have each other. There's no grandparents, no aunts and uncles, no cousins. And they're dealing with real economic pressures. So, and the film is shot in that kind of raw, rough, kind of naturalistic style. And it was bleak in some ways, but it had a real beauty and power to it. And it's one of those, for me, it was one of those small films that kind of sneaks up on you to this really big emotional effect.
Okay. I just want to interrupt 1 second. We've got a question from Sharon, who was asking about Born in Jerusalem, Still Alive. She wanted to know why the Japanese guy who was on one of his first tours continued to go with him on all the other tours. Do you?
Well, I think is this just something I didn't know about Japanese Zionism? Does everyone else know about Japanese Zionism? Is this because I read up on it. And I think it's there. They feel a really strong connection to Jerusalem, obviously, sort of religious, spiritual. And so I think he just, I think he was all just had this commitment to it as well.
Okay.
But for different reasons. Obviously.
Yeah. Okay. All right. And I'm sorry, we just have a couple minutes more. So
okay.
Do you want to, are you?
Well, I also really liked When Hitler Stole Pink Rabbit, which you talked about. And I thought, I read a negative review of it that said it was too apolitical. It was kind of saying, it's set in Germany in the 1930s, the family's Jewish, it should be worse, everything should be worse. And but I thought, it's seen through a child's eyes, and in some ways, so we don't see necessarily terrible things happening, but we often sense that there's something terrible lurking just off the edge of the screen. And so, like Anna, the little girl, she doesn't quite sense the dangers as they're crossing the border from Germany into Switzerland. But I mean, her mother certainly senses the danger, and we certainly sense the danger. And then they have to deal with, ugly, very ugly anti-Semitism. They're in Switzerland, then they're in Paris, then they're heading toward London. And I just thought it works really well as a historical drama. Like, it's just beautifully shot, immaculate period detail, but it doesn't feel distant the way some historical films feel. It's very vivid, very immediate. And I think it works as a family drama. Like, it's just really rich characterizations, terrific writing. Each family member seems very real, but also the relationships among them and how they change when they become refugees and have to reinvent themselves kind of again and again and then again. And just really terrific performances, and that the child actors are great. They're childlike but never cutesy, and I just found it very engaging, very moving, very powerful.
And of course, it's a true story. And she grew up to be a famous children's writer and illustrator, I believe, Judith Carr.
Yes.
Right? And the brother in the film became a very distinguished.
I know. Very high court judge. Yes. And a baron. I think he was.
A baron, I think. Yes. In England. So, but it is interesting because it does tell a similar kind of story to Nowhere in Africa, but like you say, it's very much from her point of view. And so that's an entirely different story.
Yeah. Like all the losses she experiences, she kind of it becomes like the loss of her pink rabbit, and she's like, why does Hitler want my pink rabbit that she has to leave behind in Berlin? It's like, what does he even want with a stuffed rabbit? So it is, yeah, but it really works.
Like little by little, as she kind of matures or just comes to grips with the reality of the situation, that she's not going home, she's not going back to her pink rabbit, and this is it. It's sort of a life of exile, of a new language and a new place, and new prejudices, and et cetera each time. So as historical drama, I thought it was a beautiful film. Biographical drama, I guess. Okay, so I think we are actually out of time. That went.
Oh yes, goodness me, yeah.
Went really fast. So I just want to take the time to say thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you for having me. I really and had a great experience watching.
As always a delight to hear you talk about movies and all things culture. And to thank everybody for joining us today. Thank you very much for your enthusiasm for the festival. We are really, really delighted that we were able to do it virtually. Hopefully next time it won't be. It will be in person again at the Bernie Theatre. But we hope you've enjoyed the films that we've selected this year. And again, I want to thank the Asper Foundation and Babs Asper Centre for Cultural Arts for being the sponsors of the festival, and very much for their support in making this happen. So enjoy the rest of the week of movies, the rest of the week of nice weather, and we'll see you soon.